We're live on YouTube, baby. Alright guys, we're live on both Facebook and YouTube. Look at that. Twitch, I'm coming for you next. Yo, I'm having a lot of fun just figuring out this streaming software, so this is mostly just a learning experience, but I was thinking like, what are cool things to explore and talk about, and I thought of this guy, Super Eye Patch Wolf, who just makes amazing YouTube videos about the silliest things that just somehow move and resonate with your soul. And something that I've been kind of exploring and really fascinated by is the way that the content we consume at a young age really impacts us. And, you know, what is our culture's current mythology? What is our inner, you know, it's like in the age where religion has lost a lot of its impact, I think the youth have turned to, you know, in a lot of ways, their early influences as a formative structure for the way that they view the world. And I think that impact has been underemphasized because of a previous, you know, stigma around these things that is really starting to unearth. We're seeing the effect so many years later that these cartoons, and the one we're particularly going to be exploring, Dragon Ball Z, really shaped the way that a lot of people view the world. And there's a narrative structure that repeats through a lot of these series that originated, or not originated, but like highly developed from Dragon Ball Z, which is called the shonen archetype. And there's certain characteristics about it. Like, for example, the idea of training is like central to it. It's all about becoming better through training, and this idea of sticking to your morals and values no matter what you face, and being willing to die and stand on the principles that you live for while pursuing an impossible dream that's only achievable through never giving up on yourself, and through the action of like relentless hard work, how a lack of talent can be overcame and you can really have an impact that changes the world. So we're going to check out one of Super Eye Patch's Wolves on the impact of Dragon Ball Z to get like just a conversation going about it's something I find really fascinating.
Everyone has that anime, the one that takes you from a place of not knowing anything about Japanese animation to one where you do. One that lets you know that the rules are different here, that everyone has...
Take it back.
That anime, the one that takes you from a place of not knowing anything about Japanese animation to one where you do. One that lets you know that the rules are different here, that these don't work the same way as Western cartoons. And for a lot of people, that anime was Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, I love this guy, Super Eye Patch Wolf, because the way that he just puts music and emotion and storytelling behind these very silly subjects, make them almost soul-shaking. And I'm really excited to go deeper in exploring the way that this repeating myth of the shonen archetype has shaped the psychological structure of so many developing people in this world, but especially young men, to really emphasize those repeating tropes that I mentioned earlier of training being essential to overcoming every obstacle, and how hard work and dedication and commitment can surmount a lack of inherent skill, and how you need to have an impossible dream, and you need to have morals and principles that you're willing to die to protect. And sometimes you might even have to sacrifice that dream for those morals and standards, but if you never give up and you never quit, you can get to that impossible place. And this framework has been repeated through various different stories, but the first time it really impacted a lot of the Western world was through Dragon Ball Z. So let's just go a little deeper into that.
Dragon Ball Z is without doubt one of the most influential properties on the planet. At 240 million volumes sold, it's the second most successful manga in history, losing out only to a series it directly inspired. But it's also the defining moment in shonen.
Look, as a coach and a trainer, I can't tell you. It's not recognized. People don't talk about it enough, but how many of the savages that you see in the gym were highly impacted by this stuff as a kid? It planted this seed. I mean, look at Goku. He's shredded, he's bleeding, he's determined, and he's fucking jacked. And that subconscious patterning at a young age, like, you can't fully really see the impact that has spread. I've seen professional athletes talk about this stuff, and some people don't even recognize that it's in there underneath the layers. Some people have fully embraced it and made it like a part of their identity to this day. And yeah, this video is good, man. Super Patch Wolf does good edits.
Anime and manga, a series that shaped nearly everything that followed it, and to which every popular series today still owes a large debt. Dragon Ball Z's success and influence have been monumental and constant. I first encountered Dragon Ball Z nearly 2 decades ago, and coming home and watching it every day after school was a massive part of my teenage years. These characters, their battles, their struggles, I was fascinated by it all, and the series left a mark on me in a way that no other show ever really has. It's because of Dragon Ball Z I started exercising. I took up martial arts and developed an interest in shonen anime in general, which eventually led me to other shows like Yu Yu Hakusho, Hajime no Ippo, and Hunter x Hunter. The experience of watching each I wouldn't trade for anything. Dragon Ball Z was such a big part of my life that I have my doubts if this channel would even exist at all without it. And to this day, I still have a fondness for the series I have for maybe only a handful of others. So, if you want a purely objective breakdown of this series, I am not the person to give it to you. I'm not blind to the series' flaws, but they're also not my goal here. Nostalgia is a huge part of what Dragon Ball Z is.
And just in case you think this is
more
just
than
some
perhaps
random
any
dude
other show, I cannot separate
internet,
my feelings of it from what
this
my life was like
has
when I first viewed it. And
1.8
so this will be
million
even more
views,
so
this
than
video.
any of my other videos, a nostalgia-gleaned personal look at what Dragon Ball Z is and was.
And you know what's
both
great?
to me, its many fans, and the
Is
industry.
if you let yourself sink into it.
And to
Even
do
if
that,
you
I
don't
think
care,
we need to go back to the
he's gonna
time
make
that
you
Dragon
care.
Ball Z
He's
first
gonna make you
touched
feel
foreign
it.
shores. We need to go back to the 90s.
Magic of music, good editing,
The late
great
90s were a
storytelling.
glorious era to be a young teenager who was first discovering your love of anime. Pokemon had been on television just long enough to climatize an audience
Do you guys
to the
remember
idea
Pokemon?
that
I mean, do you really remember Pokemon? Like, I don't know what you were about, but when I was young, that took over the universe. Like, it was everything. And just think of the mantra that song was all about. I want to be the very best that no one ever... Like, you don't think that's, like, woven so deeply into us? And I'll just speak from my personal experience. Like, it's in my DNA at this point. It's like I'm too far gone. You can't save me. And it started with this early stuff. Like, do we consider this? Have we really taken a step back and just like tried to see how this sort of content at a young age really formed us? Maybe it's maybe it resonates with certain people more than others. For me, it certainly resonated.
Japanese animation existed, and
To this day, I'm a trainer. I want my clients to be the strongest version of themselves they can be. I'm trying to level up their stats. It is this, it's yeah, maybe it's just me.
success of the Sony PlayStation popularized Japanese role-playing games among a mainstream gaming audience, with generation-defining titles like Final Fantasy VII being the breakout hits of the system. And perhaps most importantly, the perforation of consumer-grade 56K modems meant that by the end of the decade, the vast majority of households were now equipped to explore the internet.
Isn't it crazy to think how far we've come in just a few years? Like, when I was younger, the internet was not a thing. And like, Now I have a 3-screen live screen
meaning
setup.
niche interests didn't need to be quite so niche anymore. If you were so inclined, you could now connect with other anime fans, give and receive recommendations, or in my case, spend days and days downloading AMVs set to Linkin Park. But even then, for a lot of people of that era, anime was still confined to the box art of games or obscure titles that would play on the barren TV slots that haunted the early hours of the morning. And if anime was to truly explode in the West, there would need to be an easily consumable, constant source of it. And that source came during the final breath of the 90s when Sean Atkins and Jason DeMarco relaunched their Toonami serialization block in 1999. Toonami was nothing less than a revolutionary siren call for a generation of young...
Toonami was so lit. Man, who remembers Toonami? Like, it's crazy because back in the day I didn't have access to like a TV all the time, so I could never follow like this series out. You just catch like one episode of something out of nowhere, have no context, and be like, what the hell did I just see? I was watching a lot of TV, but every time I remember seeing shit like Neon Genesis Evangelist like at 3 in the morning when I was young, and just being like, what the hell just happened?
Anime fans, replacing the older, more traditional Power Zone slot with a block filled nearly entirely with Eastern properties, such as Gundam Wing, Outlaw Star, and Sailor Moon. Up until now, the only real way to consume these shows was through trading VHS tapes or downloading low-quality fan subs online. But now, anime was being broadcast directly into our living rooms, and it was mind-blowing. And at the center of this movement and Toonami's most popular show was Dragon Ball Z. Keep in mind that this was late 90s American television, where the most popular animated shows were family-friendly titles like Doug and Rugrats. And by comparison, Dragon Ball Z was shocking. The show felt like a gateway into an entirely different world, a violent and even dark place, one of insanely powerful villains that committed genocide with barely a second thought, and horrific alternate futures, where our entire cast of heroes, as well as the vast majority of the human race, had been wiped out by malevolent, psychopathic androids. It was a series where people could suffer grave bodily injury and heroes could die. It felt like a show you shouldn't be watching, one that couldn't possibly be airing on children's television, and yet it was. It also felt bizarrely unknowable and even a little mysterious. Dragon Ball Z was of course based on the Akira Toriyama manga Dragon Ball, and what we know as Dragon Ball Z is actually just the latter 325 chapters of Dragon Ball. The Z was only added when the original anime was rebooted with a new staff. This rebooted anime was then localized first by Ocean Dubbing and then by Funimation, and this version that aired on Toonami in the late 90s and early 2000s.
I mean, the little backstory, it's like, it's not, this isn't the most fascinating part. It gets more interesting, but it's just setting a pace and reminding us like how life was back then, man.
And so what we essentially got was the second half of an ongoing story. Unless you caught the very first episode in the 100 plus episode cycle, you had no real context for what a Saiyan was, who the Red Ribbon Army were, or what in the name of dear sweet chocolate Christ was going on with Chiaotzu. But this lack of information was also kind of tantalizing, adding greatly to the show's already palpable sense of mystique. And a lot of the fun of watching Dragon Ball Z on Toonami was slowly piecing together the details of this world and learning how it all tied together. And when you did, what you got was the story of Goku and the Z Fighters, a group of supremely powerful martial artists who would have to defend the Earth from even more supremely powerful villains, in battles that would play out as bombastic, violent showdowns. And these encounters were the centerpieces of Dragon Ball Z. The first thing that's going to hit anyone unfamiliar with Dragon Ball Z is the show's unrelenting focus on combat and action scenes. Go to any random episode or chapter and you'll likely find two overly muscled men beating the soul out of one another, or very occasionally a slightly muscled girl. I love you so much, 18. But it was the nature and scale of the combat that was so fresh and exciting. Characters could fly, had the strength and durability to both punch and be punched through mountains, villains, as well as the ability to let off massive, planet-shaking energy blasts. And in the process of these catastrophic showdowns, entire countrysides would be torn apart, and cities would buckle and burst under the strain of attacks that could be measured on a galactic scale. It was violent, it was destructive, and it was deeply cathartic. It was easy to get lost in the sheer chaos of it. Whatever problems you had, whatever difficult realities you faced, it all faded away in the blistering light of such raw, destructive escapism. And this was one of the main qualities that made the show stand out against a sea of its more everyday Western counterparts. And this aspect was only heightened by the very specific way the show handled its villains. Each arc of DBZ was defined by the appearance of a new, more powerful foe, and it was around these characters that the events of the story unfolded.
And this is like another really essential repeating pattern that you see in all of these, what I call shonen archetype stories, is this idea that like as you level up, the enemies level up to meet you. So no matter how strong you get, there is always a stronger foe waiting on the other side to continue to push you, to continue to test you. And in life really parallels that. I feel like it's like it never gets easier. As we level up, the world levels up to face us in new, interesting, challenging ways. And that is shown through this sort of storytelling.
What's interesting about how Dragon Ball Z uses its villains is how dramatically differently they were framed compared to the standard villains that were popular in both Western and Eastern children's media of the time. Most children's entertainment of this era was structured to be highly episodic, with entire plot lines developing and concluding in a single episode. And so if there was a villain, they were usually designed to be introduced, fought, and defeated in the same 22-minute span. And for decades, this was how children's television worked, clinging rigorously to the monster of the week formula, as seen in shows like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, He-Man, and Thundercats. This kind of villain had actually been around even longer on Japanese television, coming to prominence in the mid-70s with classic Sentai shows like Kamen Rider, and eventually permeated its way into the power-obsessed anime and manga of the 80s, where underpowered disposable villains were routinely obliterated by hyper-powerful heroes like Kenshiro. The advantage of these disposable, replaceable bad guys was that it was a simple, repeatable, episodic formula, one that wouldn't alienate new viewers but would constantly introduce new opportunities for merchandise, while also consistently framing our heroes in the most powerful and victorious possible light. But then came the villains of Dragon Ball Z. Ultra-powerful, near-invincible demigods, beings whose mere existence was so cataclysmic that they would dominate entire story arcs, committing atrocities on a mass scale and forcing our heroes into tense, desperate battles, where survival seemed unlikely and victory felt impossible. No longer monsters of the week, these were just monsters, routinely and soundly defeating our heroes, ones that shattered the 22-minute structure and planted their feet deep in the story, staying there for dozens and dozens of episodes, during which the entire plot would center solely around their existence. The story framed these villains in a way that made them feel so dominant and powerful that the idea of their defeat seemed genuinely impossible. But this created an exhilarating tension, as you really felt every blow, every energy blast as our heroes inched our way forward in the face of such monstrously overwhelming odds. So when victory did occur, it felt profound and earned. One of the reasons Goku's victory over Frieza feels so monumental is that at this point in the story, you've watched Frieza decimate our heroes for dozens of episodes, defeating Nail, Gohan, Piccolo, Vegeta, Krillin. In a climate where 22-minute villains reign supreme, Frieza felt like nothing less than a god. And watching Goku putting everything he had into battling Frieza and eventually surpassing him, it was nothing short of inspirational. It really felt like this character had gone through a monumentally punishing ordeal and somehow come out the other end and survived. This aspect of Dragon Ball Z is one of the main qualities that would come to define what shonen battle manga is, and be echoed in many classic arcs that followed throughout the years, One Piece's Enies Lobby, Yu Yu Hakusho's Dark Tournament Saga, Hunter x Hunter's Chimera Ant arc. These are some of the greatest arcs in shonen history, and each one uses the same fundamental villain-centric structure that was defined and popularized in Dragon Ball Z. With everything we've talked about up until now, it could be quite easy to boil Dragon Ball Z down as a consecutive series of one-on-one fights. And you know what? It totally was. All of Dragon Ball Z's major plot points center around the idea of combat. But I also don't view that as an objective flaw either. And the reason for that is that these characters are all written around the concept of fighting. And to explain what I mean here, let's take a little look at this scene from early on in the Android Saga. Goku and company receive a cryptic warning from the future that in 3 years, evil androids will rise up and devastate civilization. And Bulma suggests that by using the Dragon Balls, they could stop the androids before they ever activate. But Goku and the rest of the Z fighters outright refuse. They want to face the incoming android threat. They want to test themselves against these new, more powerful foes, despite reliable confirmation that they and most of humanity will be wiped out in the process. The takeaway from this scene is that combat wasn't actually a way to solve problems to these characters. Rather, it was justification for why they exist at all. These were all proud fighters who put an immense amount of personal weight into their physical strength and skill. Or to put it a different way, Dragon Ball Z wasn't a story about fighting, it was a story about a group of characters who really loved to fight. Conflict was how these characters defined themselves. Whether it's Vegeta's identity as the prince of all Saiyans, Goku's pride in being the strongest under the heavens, or Frieza's belief that he is the most powerful being in the universe. You could see this both in the delight these characters took while fighting, as well as the rigorous and often grueling training they would put themselves through between battles. And it was here in these scenes that you could really witness the characters' passion for both combat and self-improvements, as they'd struggle to surpass their limits and achieve new plateaus of strength. And as a teenager, hell, as a grown-ass adult, these scenes were incredibly influential. You were watching characters who were extremely passionate about something and who poured everything they had into it. And it made you want to work hard as well. You wanted to feel the same rush that they did. This also gave the fight scenes a more personal and intense emotional edge. These characters had sweat and bled to reach their current level of strength. They carried an intense amount of pride in their abilities, and it made combat feel personal. Victory felt monumental and validating, while defeat was emotional and devastating. A loss to these characters didn't just mean a loss, it was a deep personal affront to how they saw themselves, and something they may not recover from for years to come. This also meant that when protagonists stepped out to face one of the show's immensely powerful villains, there was a real emotional weight to it, like it was more than just a battle of good versus evil, but something that really personally mattered to both characters. So, the plot of Dragon Ball Z revolved around a shifting power balance between its heroes and villains. And so when a character did hit a new level of power, it was a major turning point in the story. And these moments were conveyed through Dragon Ball Z's now iconic transformation scenes. Because of how the show framed its heroes and villains, the transformations of both archetypes felt...
And that's another repeating pattern that you see in a lot of this stuff. It's like, there is a hidden power within us that we haven't yet tapped into, and we can reach these transformation points, which are almost like these progress thresholds where once you cross over it, you access a power that is completely beyond what was available before. And I do believe this is mirrored in life. We have these moments in life where we transform, where we transcend, where we shift, and all of a sudden we are now capable of something that we previously weren't capable of. And it does happen in these, like, you train, you work, boom, snap, boom, Super Saiyan. And oftentimes, you know, like in the transformations in these shows, it doesn't sustain. It comes back and you crash down levels, but you gain access to returning to that state. You now know that transformational way of being is possible, and through training, you can learn to spend more time in that state, and you can learn to even transcend further and create that as your new baseline as you go up these layers of infinitely progressing power structures.
It's drastically different. When a villain transformed, it was a nightmare, the worst possible case scenario, as the gap in power now widened into an abyss. A villain's transformation was also something they either always had access to, or could only be achieved through external means, such as Cell consuming the androids or Boo absorbing other fighters. And this worked very differently to how the heroes transformed. Heroes' transformations, for the most part, were internal, something that could only be achieved through massive amounts of the aforementioned training, or having to push through some deep emotional barrier that would then allow them to unleash their true potential. And because of how these moments were framed, they felt monumental, both because the heroes finally had a ray of hope in the face of the villains, as well as being deeply significant to the personal narratives of these characters. And the reason for this is that these scenes represented major moments in our characters' lives, the culmination of months, years, or even lifetimes of training and struggle, instances where a character's entire existence is changed and they finally become what they were meant to be. And as a teenager, where you were constantly unsure of every aspect of your physical and emotional identity, these transformations were a powerful fantasy to believe in. The idea that we all had a massive amount of latent potential inside us that could be unleashed in an instant and change everything.
I believe that shit, man. Tell me there's not some resonant truth to that. We all have this massive potential inside us that can be unleashed at a moment's notice if we just break through the right emotional barriers and tap into that latent potential. And how he says you have to break through emotional barriers, like, if that ain't the key, right?
This is also yet another aspect of the series that would come to define what shonen battle titles were, with major moments of even modern titles still featuring the same kind of transformations that were defined and popularized in Dragon Ball Z. So what you had with Dragon Ball Z was an animation that felt more violent, dark, and exciting than anything even close to its time slot, where passionate, combat-driven characters faced down invincible villains in impossible battles. To a Western teenager who was raised on the family-friendly cartoons of this era, the concepts being introduced by Dragon Ball Z were not only fresh, but mind-blowing. And the reason the show shook the West like it did, and created a generation of young anime fans hungry to discover more series like it. I should note that at this point I've mainly been talking about Dragon Ball Z from a mostly Western perspective, but in Japan, unlike the West, it was the manga that came first. The manga is probably the purest way to experience Dragon Ball Z, as well as being brilliant in some ways that only manga really can. But given the scope and length of this video, I think to do that topic justice, we need to return to it another day. What I would like to concentrate on, though, is the production of the anime, and in particular, some of the aspects it both added to and changed about the original manga. And to be clear, I'm talking about the original 291 episode version that aired on Toonami way back when, and not the 167 episode recut Dragon Ball Z Kai that released in 2008. But more on Kai in a little bit. The reason the anime of Dragon Ball Z was seen as a reboot and not just a continuation was the addition of two new key staff members, Kozo Morishita as director and Takao Koyama as writer, both of whom contributed a great deal to shaping the look and feel of the anime. The reason Morishita was brought on board was that Kazuhiko Torishima, the former editor of the series, was dissatisfied with how the anime of Dragon Ball looked, feeling that it was failing to capture the more serious tone of the manga. And so Morishita was brought on board at the launch of Z, starting at the Raditz Saga. And what's cool is you can actually see the look of the anime evolve and shift over the course of its run, with the Raditz Saga still having a lot of the soft and imprecise line work that was inherent to the original, all the way up to the finely honed, razor-sharp drawings of the Boo Saga, and I really love how the show looks at this point. There's a real energy and solidity to how these characters move. Morishita was also the one responsible for a lot of the more interesting art direction in Z, He wasn't afraid to take a scene from the manga and drench it in a searing neon colour palette, and it gave a lot of the fight scenes this unrestrained, nearly surreal edge. Morishita would also drastically increase the level of destruction and chaos of these fights, adding in brand new stages and taking the time to animate and accentuate the damage to the surroundings, which really helped communicate the magnitude of these battles. And it was little touches like this that gave some of the story's biggest moments a far more grandiose and even emotional impact than they had in the original manga. As for Koyama, he was not only the screenwriter of the show, but he also wrote the first 13 Dragon Ball Z movies, and was the creator of popular, technically non-canon characters like Broly and Cooler. He also wrote a rare Dragon Ball Z side manga called Prince Vegeta, a supplementary comic illustrated by Minoru Maeda that fleshed out Vegeta's backstory and early life. And to this day, you can still see him giving interviews arguing that Broly could kick anyone's ass in Super. I bring all this up because I think it shows one thing. Koyama was extremely passionate about these characters. And you could see this especially in the additional scenes he'd add to the show, which he'd use to flesh out these characters, their relationships and backstories. Take this scene from Trunks' battle with Cell. In the manga, Cell basically just curb stomps the young Saiyan, but in the anime, the scene is given some much needed weight and context by fleshing out both fighters' stories with individual flashback scenes. The first is Trunks explaining the hardships he had to endure in the android-ravaged future, including an especially tragic sequence where we actually watch the Z fighters one by one being hunted down and wiped out by the androids. And I really love this scene because it really helps communicate just how dire Trunks' future was. But then Cell too shares his story, how he awoke in the distant timeline after the androids and Z fighters had wiped each other out and found himself trapped and alone in the broken future, unable to evolve without his android counterparts. It's a minor moment, but it does add an ever so slight air of sympathy for Cell, as, just like Trunks, he had to endure a ruined future and find his way back to the past. And as a result, even though the fight itself isn't especially memorable, the way the characters' narratives are intertwined through their backstories forms an odd kind of connection between the two. It makes them both feel like they've really been through a lot to bring them to this point, giving the encounter some much needed emotional context. And this is what Koyama brought to Dragon Ball Z. More flashbacks, more emotion, more Piccolo and Gohan slowly forming the cutest friendship on the planet, more Vegeta being sad in the rain, just more of these characters and who they were. There were also other aspects that contributed to the show's success, and particularly in the West, one of which was Bruce Faulkner's incredible soundtrack, which underlaid many of the show's scenes with a deliciously dark, synthetic audio.
How good is this guy at video essays? I mean, come on, like look at this detail and research. I don't care to know about any of this shit, but I'm just fascinated by how passionate he is and how much he puts into it. And this is something I love about YouTube videos is I'll find different channels where people, they talk about something that it's like I feel their passion through it to such a degree that it makes me more passionate about it than I was before.
Audio flavor, while also bringing a good degree of heart to some of its more poignant moments. And likewise with a lot of the voice work, some of which was incredible. In particular, the performance of Christopher Sabat, who voiced both Piccolo and Vegeta. And just listen to the emotion he brings to this scene as Piccolo begs Goku to stop the fight between Gohan and Cell.
Do you want to know what he's thinking? He's not thinking about strength or about competition. He's wondering why his father is standing there, letting him die. And so your son may be the most powerful person in the world, but he's also a scared 11-year-old boy.
I mention all these individuals because while the manga is brilliant and singular, many people were responsible for the success of the Dragon Ball Z anime, and considering that's the version that brought the series to a global audience, I felt like they deserved some credit here. So, up until this point in the video, I've been treating Dragon Ball Z as gently as I possibly could. I haven't talked about any of the series' faults. I haven't spoken about the nearly absurd level of filler that pads out and bogs down nearly every part of the anime, how the overuse of cost-saving animation techniques drags the quality of the fights down, how there's places in the manga where you can really feel Toriyama's exhaustion, as he at this point had been writing weekly manga for nearly 2 decades, and his fatigue shows in the occasional drop in quality of the art or how contrived some of the writing feels, especially later on around the Boo saga. The series suffers from basically every issue a long-running shonen manga can. Power creep, an underutilized supporting cast, the Piccolo effects. These were all problems that I didn't see as a teenager, but now, years later, they're impossible for me to ignore. And even outside those criticisms, it's hard not to see now how other shows have taken the foundation Dragon Ball Z laid out and built upon it. It's a far simpler story than titles like One Piece or Hunter x Hunter, and those series arguably took what Dragon Ball Z did and built more interesting and creative worlds around it, and filled those worlds with a more diverse and compelling cast of characters. Titles like Yu Yu Hakusho also took the themes of Dragon Ball Z and expressed them in infinitely more relatable, human, and heartfelt ways. And so, the truth is, I don't really know what it is for a person in 2018 to come to Dragon Ball Z for the first time. As much as I love the series, I find it difficult to recommend anybody 291 episodes of anything. And while Kai certainly makes that a lot more digestible, it's not the version of the show I grew up with. Having dropped the iconic Bruce Faulkner soundtrack and cutting a lot of the additional scenes, including the 2 mentioned above, and rewriting a lot of Koyama's dialogue to better match the manga, and in the process, losing a lot of the subtlety and nuance, as well as a host of other minor nitpicks that I'm sure very few people but me will actually care about. And even then, for me personally, I don't know that I'm ever going to go back and rewatch Dragon Ball Z in its entirety. I don't know that I'll ever be at a place in my life again where I'd have the time or desire to make that possible. But in a way, I think that's okay, because what's more important to me than that is the memory the show has left me with. And so, it only feels right to end this video.
There's something about the way this dude talks where he's like, and then, and so, at the end of his videos, he's so good at like, speaking in a way that brings in emotional characteristics.
Video with the part of Dragon Ball Z that stayed with me the longest, and the character that affected me the most. Vegeta enters Dragon Ball Z's story as the main villain of its second arc. Born a warrior prince to the Saiyan race, Vegeta's combat capabilities excelled from an early age, fighting and winning alongside his father, King Vegeta, defining his identity by his ferocity and strength, declaring himself the elite of the elite, the prince of all Saiyans. These times would not last, however, as one day, Vegeta watches his father defeated by the malicious space warlord Frieza, who takes Vegeta as an indentured servant in exchange for sparing his life, his father, and his people, only to go back on that agreement later, as Frieza destroys the Saiyan home planet and wiping out nearly the entire race. Vegeta, now one of only 4 remaining Saiyans, continues to battle under Frieza in the hopes of becoming one day powerful enough to rise up and defeat him, during which time he suffers a humiliating defeat on Earth at the hands of Goku, a low-born Saiyan commoner. After much hardship, the day finally comes when Vegeta believes he has finally ascended to the level of the legendary Super Saiyan and faces off against Frieza only to be crushed under the heel of the invincible warlord, and then watches in disgrace as Goku did what he never could, becoming a Super Saiyan and finally bringing an end to Frieza's reign. Vegeta, now without purpose or direction, goes to live on Earth and trains relentlessly in order to surpass his rival and escape the shadow that Goku has cast. But as time marches on, he finds himself slowly becoming a reluctant ally both to Goku and the people of Earth. The years go by and Vegeta awakens one day to a life he no longer recognizes. He now has a human wife and half-Saiyan child, whom he's actually grown to care for. During which time the warrior prince he once was has started to feel like a distant memory. This realization awakens within Vegeta a deep anger. How could the prince of all Saiyans be reduced to the common life of a family man? And in that anger, he trades his soul for the acquisition of greater power and turns on his former allies, attacking and killing a crowd of innocent people in a bid to drag Goku into one final, terrible fight. These actions would bring about the rise of Majin Buu, an invincible monster that would wreak havoc across the Earth. And so Vegeta, faced with the destruction he has now wrought, takes his son into his arms and hugs him for the first time, before sending him away and stepping out to face the monster once again. And in the first selfless act of his existence, gives his life in one final brilliant attack. Like every character in Dragon Ball Z, death would only prove temporary for Vegeta, and he'd later return to aid Goku in the final battle against Buu, finally letting go of his pride and accepting Goku as both an ally and a friend. Vegeta's story hit me so hard in my younger years, and I'd be lying if I said that ever stopped being the case. And the reason for that is that despite all his strength, despite the fact that he existed in a universe of explosive spectacle and superpowered showdowns, he still felt so real and flawed. Someone with an intense amount of both pride and self-loathing, who would measure themselves against everyone around them. A person who would make disastrous self-destructive decisions and suffer crushing defeat after crushing defeat. Someone who would awaken one day to realize that life hasn't turned out like they planned, that the person they thought they would become is now never going to exist. And yet someone who at the end of everything was still able to find contentment. And that is some heavy shit to put in a children's cartoon that aired every day at 5 p.m. But in a broader sense, Vegeta also represents what I love about Dragon Ball Z. You'd watch these characters reach deep down inside themselves in order to face the overwhelmingly impossible. And in the light of that, getting up the next day and heading out into the world and dealing with whatever problems you face there, it made it feel a little more possible. Dragon Ball Z wasn't a story about getting what you want, it was one about surpassing who you are. And this to me is the legacy of the series.
It's not about getting what you want, it's about surpassing who you are. This guy's a poet, I'm telling you, the way he can just
blast it let off, the reverberations of which would be felt throughout the entirety of shonen storytelling for decades to follow, and the resulting force of which would punch through global barriers and create entire continents of new anime fans. It's a story about great characters doing impossible things. And for me, for an industry, and for a generation, this was the impact of Dragon Ball Z. The series that changed everything.
Yeah. I just like watching this guy's videos, man. I feel like more people need to see it. That's a fun one. And I'm really just testing out this live stream, so we got it going for the first time on YouTube and Facebook at the same time. I'm gonna hop off here. I'm gonna try to get the Twitch. I'm gonna make a Twitch account, and we're gonna get the Twitch. And
I can remember
so
being
many
taken
more
to
fun
see
things.
Space Jam in the cinema.
This one's really good. This Space Jam 2 is a live. There's so much more we're gonna be doing on live streams, but one thing is definitely I'm gonna be finding things that I find awesome and cool and resonate with the soul and just sharing them with people. One of the reasons I was playing that particular video is because I'm inspired to create a sort of training program in course built around the shonen archetype. Like, there are repeating tropes that I think can be turned into exercises that we can dive deeper into and explore. For example, like clearly defining what are your morals and principles, what are you willing to die for, what are the things that you're willing to fight for, what elements are you training, what are your superpowers, where are you trying to level up, what does transformation look like? And there's a lot coming to mind and forming there, but that archetype resonates so much that I feel like it could be explored in a much more powerful container by anyone who feels like just becoming a fucking Super Saiyan. Alright, I'm gonna end this one and get a Twitch going.